Hey everybody, this is Volts for June 27th, 2025. Reducing the climate impacts of food and farming. I'm your host, David Roberts. A year ago, when I interviewed energy expert Michael Grunwald, we confessed to our mutual climate blind spot, agriculture. It's unquestionably a big contributor to climate change and getting bigger, but it's just not something we've been able to muster interest in over the years. That very exchange appears in the introduction of journalist Michael Grunwald's new book, We Are Eating the Earth. It is used as an example of the lack of attention given to agriculture in the larger climate world. Guilty as charged. Grunwald is a fellow energy nerd, but unlike me, about 5 years ago, he steered into his ignorance about agriculture and fell down a rabbit hole where he has been researching and writing ever since. You may have seen his Canary Media columns on this subject. Grunwald is an old-school journalist who's been a reporter at the Washington Post, Time, and Politico magazine. His first book, 2006's The Swamp, was definitive on the subject of the Florida Everglades and its woes. His second book, 2012's The New Deal, was about Obama's stimulus bill and remains underrated, in my opinion. It was extremely educational to me at the time and looks prescient in retrospect. Eating the Earth is his third book, and I figured since he's gone to the trouble of learning about this stuff and I haven't, I should at least ask him about it. So I'm going to quiz him on the many things he's learned about these last few years, from indoor farming to gene editing, biofuels to veganism. All right, let's go to the farm. With no further ado, Mike Grunwald, welcome to Volts at long last. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. I've been a fan for so long.
We have been joking that I have avoided this topic pretty assiduously my entire 20-year career, and having now read through your book and grappled with this a little bit, I'm not sure I've been persuaded to the contrary, but we can discuss some of the reasons for that as we go.
It's been nice talking to you.
Yeah. Anywho, bye, Mike. So let's start here. Let's start at the highest possible level. Just give me the sort of, by the way, I've got like 400 questions for you. So we're going to have to move along here. You're going to have to do the sort of elevator pitch version of all these answers. Just obviously listeners can go read your book if they want the full deal. So let's start here. Just give me the sort of elevator pitch for why climate types need to pay more attention to agriculture.
Well, food and agriculture is a third of the climate problem. Right. And it gets about 2% of climate finance. And I think, about like 0.5% of climate conversation. I'll tell a story of how I got into this, because I was, like you, an energy dork, not quite as perhaps a committed an energy dork. But actually, I was writing a piece for Politico magazine about my new green life. I think I beat you to solar panels and an electric car.
I still don't have solar panels. I'm a terrible greenie.
But the point was that, hey, I'm a climate reporter. I care about the climate, but I'm doing this not because I'm an eco saint, but because I know enough about this that this is going to save me money.
Right.
And my feeling was that this was about to go mainstream. So I had this kind of throwaway line about how, look, I don't line dry my laundry. I don't unplug my computer at night. I still eat meat. But when I went back and looked at that, I was like, wait a minute. I don't even know if eating meat is bad for the climate. I genuinely had no idea. And so I called this guy, Tim Searchinger, who I knew, and he said, yes, duh. But I realized, if I didn't know anything about food and climate, then probably other people didn't. And it's just, even putting climate aside, agriculture is the leading driver of deforestation. It's the leading driver of wetland destruction, water pollution, water shortages. It makes a huge mess. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, one of the one of the messages that comes through clearly in your book, which constitutes one of the reasons why I find paying attention to this subject dreary, is you're like, we shouldn't fall in the trap of thinking as in energy that there's good energy and there's clean energy and dirty energy, and the dirty energy is the bad guy and the clean energy is the good guy. It's pretty simple on the energy side. It's not that simple on the ag side. As a matter of fact, a farm is bad ipso facto for nature. Any kind, the shift from wilderness to farmed land constitutes the bulk of the environmental damage that farming does, and that it doesn't matter what kind of farming you're doing on that land. Farming in and of itself is a necessary evil, you call it. So it's just like levels of bad here that we're basically discussing. Unavoidable, necessary levels of bad.
That's exactly right.
How fun is that, Mike?
Well, no, it's super fun.
But anyway, so agriculture, so there's the sort of tripartite problem here with agriculture that you go over in the first chapter, which is that population's growing, so we need more food. Climate change is happening, so we need lots fewer GHGs from that more food. And biodiversity is dying. Land use is a problem, so we need that more food grown using less greenhouse gases on less land. Basically, like that is the tripartite agriculture challenge. And it's like, that's insoluble, Mike, which hard. Is basically the conclusion you come to at the end of the book.
No, I don't think I'm that Debbie Downer. I would say I've concluded that we have not yet begun to solve it.
Yeah, right.
But I think I have a lot of promising solutions. And look, I do remind you that, you started writing about this stuff, in 2004?
Yeah.
At that time,
true. Energy was bleak then, too.
There were no alternatives to fossil fuels, right? There was no solar, no wind. The one alternative, and we'll, I'm sure, talk about this, was biofuels, farm-grown fuels, which turn out to be, way worse than gasoline. So I think this is hard. It is, and you're right. I wouldn't say every farm is bad, but I do say that because look, we got to eat it, but every farm makes a mess. I say that every farm is a kind of environmental crime scene, right? It's like this, it's like an echo of whatever nature was cleared to make room for it.
But this is the problem, because I want to emphasize this, because this shapes a lot of what you say for the rest of the book, which is that getting more out of less land with fewer GHGs is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And the main lever you have to pull is yields, which we're going to get to. But sort of like the obsession with yields comes out of this tripartite problem. So this is sort of the background problem of agriculture. We need to make it less land intensive, less GHG intensive, but we need lots more of it. And that's like, I don't even know what the right analogy is. It's doing something like incredibly difficult, 3 incredibly difficult things that we've never really done in earnest at once.
I know you hate sports ball, but my basketball analogy is that we need to get more offensive rebounds, but also do a better job getting back on transition defense. It is like,
I'm sure some listeners out there will know what that means.
It's the more with less. And it is, look, and I think there is, you're right, that I do talk about the supply side. We need to make more food with less land. And we also, on the demand side, we need to have less land intensive diets.
Yeah. I want to go through all the various and sundry solutions that I'm just going to be tossing them to you for you to take swings at them. But before we get there, I just want to start, because the book starts with like 100 pages of accounting of the story of biofuels, basically the story of our assessment of biofuels. And obviously, we don't have time for you to recount that whole story, but sort of the main lesson that comes out of it, the main point of contention in all that fighting was, what is the role of land use, basically? Like land, the question of land, because, people were doing the calculation, like, you grow corn, it absorbs the GHGs, then you burn the corn, it releases them, you grow the corn, it absorbs them again. It's carbon neutral, but like, as scientists came along and started pointing out, like, but if you're using that corn for fuel, they got to grow the corn to eat somewhere else, right? So if you're doing this with the land, you're not doing that with the land. It's called opportunity cost. So just talk a little bit about the role of land use in that fight and why it took 20 years to get people to pay attention to it.
This was the one thing I knew about this area before I dove into this book, was because I had traveled to Brazil in 2008 and wrote a piece about how essentially corn ethanol in the United States was tearing down Amazon because through this exact mechanism you just described. If you're going to grow fuel, then somewhere else you're going to need to grow more food. And guess what? It's not going to be a parking lot. It's going to come out of nature, and it's going to come out of, these forests that are full of carbon and also absorb the carbon that we're pumping into the atmosphere with our fossil fuels. So my line is that it's kind of like if you want to fix the climate while you're deforesting, it's like trying to, clean your house while blowing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. You just can't do it.
But this seems obvious and intuitive, right?
Right. It seems incredibly obvious, but essentially, you've, I'm sure, done more, looking at life cycle analyses over the last 20 years than you want to admit. And we all have. But up until, this wetlands lawyer, who's the kind of star of my story, Tim Searchinger, he's the guy who I first called and asked if meat is bad for the climate. He was just this lawyer and he thought that seemed weird. Why don't these climate analyses take land use into account? Because actually growing ethanol, the actual production of ethanol, he's looking at these studies, it's worse than producing gasoline. You use more energy, it produces, so they were all of the benefits, the supposed benefits from corn ethanol were from growing the corn. And Tim just looked at this and said, well, wait a minute. When that cornfield was just growing food, it was still soaking up that carbon. So
Exactly.
What the heck is going on here? And it sounds, he was at Environmental Defense Fund at the time, and he got into this huge fight at work where the chief economist there was kind of like, are you saying you're the only person who realized this? And he was kind of like, well, yeah. I mean, nobody else.
And the fight is that, the sort of technical basis for the fight is that it is very difficult to pin down a counterfactual. It's just very difficult to say what would have happened if you didn't do X, right? But
it's hard to pin it down exactly.
Right. As your hero says, it's obviously not zero, right?
Right. And it's obviously a lot. These studies were essentially claiming that if you just stopped growing corn in the United States for food and just instead put it all in our fuel tanks, that it would have no effect on global deforestation. And that was obviously preposterous. And I do, as a side note, have to mention, look, my hero, even though he was not a scientist, he got a piece published about this in Science. It caused a lot. He created this idea of indirect land use change, which is now any life cycle analysis involving biofuels, or really just about anything involving land, has to account for ILUC, indirect land use change. And I do have to point out that the House Republican bill, the big, beautiful bill that, that's getting rid of most of the clean energy stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act, not only does it extend the credit for biofuels, but it specifically has language that when you do the analysis, you can't look at indirect land use change. so
awesome.
Amazing. It's because it comes out with answers that corn growers and soy growers don't like.
Yeah.
And that's what's behind all this.
Yeah, there's a huge industry. Anybody who's been in our area for as long as we have knows that this is a huge industry, and it is a political third rail. You can't get rid of this stuff. People pop up occasionally. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on biofuels. I will just say
they're bad.
They're bad. And that's across the board. They're bad for sustainable aviation fuels. They're bad to make synthetic natural gas. The math does not work.
It doesn't
basically
work.
For anybody. I think if you're capturing methane gases that were otherwise going to be vented into the atmosphere and doing something with them, fine. But that's to avoid doing them in the atmosphere. It's not like you're going to get a good economical.
Well, I will say if you're actually using a waste product to make your biofuel, then it's probably okay. But a lot of those anaerobic digesters that are turning manure into biogas, they're terrible too. In fact, the WRI looked at like 20 different ways that you can better manage manure. 19 of them were cost effective, and of course, all the money is going into these anaerobic digesters because because farmers get paid for them, and that's the one that isn't cost effective. They're mostly like craft brewing biofuels. So really anything that uses land. I mean, I know I'm hopefully a broken record because this is my message, but we are eating the earth, and it's agriculture that's eating the earth, and biofuels, it turns out, are only eating about a Texas worth of the earth. While, for instance, livestock are eating 50 Texases worth of the earth.
Right. This is the second part of the message about biofuels is they're bad. If you've heard that they're bad, that's correct. They are bad. What about this new other kind? Also bad. But scale-wise, agriculture, whatever damage biofuels may be doing, agriculture is doing the same damage at vaster scale. That's sort of the point of that section of the book, is like it segues into the larger land use dilemma, which is mostly about agriculture.
Exactly. And this is something we all kind of know, right? When you look out the window when you're in the plane, you see all those squares and circles, and it's like, holy shit, there's a lot of agriculture out there.
Yeah, the numbers are bracing. Like our settlements, I forget the exact numbers you use in the book, but like our actual physical settlements, cities that we live in, it's like 2 or 3% of...
Yeah, I'd say one going towards 2% of the land on Earth, while agriculture is about 40%. So, you and I, we've both done a lot of work on the sort of scourge of urban sprawl and the importance of urban density. But just think like agricultural sprawl is 30, 40 times as bad. And,
yes.
That's what's eating our forests.
Yes, the land use problem, to a first approximation, is the agricultural problem. So what I want to do here for like the next 30 minutes or so is do a little bit of a speed round because we've got a lot to get through and not a ton of time. I just want to kind of throw familiar solutions at you. And I want you to tell me sort of like how to think about them. Having spent 5 years of your life immersed in this miserable research, you've learned all this stuff. Tell me sort of like what is the scale of this solution? How should we think about it?
It was fun research. It was just the writing. You're going to say
it was fun to write a book?
No, it was just the button seat writing part that was hell. But running around the world, talking to people, I'm sure you see this with energy, right? I mean, before we get into the solutions, I should say it's like really exciting because I'm a cynic, I'm a grouch, but it's really cool talking to these, scientists and entrepreneurs who are thinking about this really massive problem and are just like, hey, let's try to fix it. And they have these unbelievably...
That's my whole job, Mike. That's the only thing that keeps me sane. So I'm glad you got jazzed out of it. Okay, so I'm gonna start with, I think, probably some easier ones and get to the harder ones later.
Sure.
Let's start with indoor farming. People love the idea of indoor farming because you can precisely control conditions. You eliminate insects. You eliminate any pests, any natural threat. You can improve yields, etc. So.
Right. Not to mention night, right?
Yes, you can grow during
weather.
The night. Yes, you can grow during winter. You can grow year-round. So there's a lot of obvious advantages.
It's a great place to start because it's, in many ways, the allure of indoor farming. It sort of highlights all the problems with outdoor farming, including, that it eats the earth. It uses so much land. So what if we could just put it in a skyscraper, like in downtown Newark?
Right. If you're trying to make it more intensive, more out of less land.
Exactly.
Like stacking up, going vertical, squeezing it all together. It sounds...
It's amazing, right? Instead of having a harvest, maybe twice a year, you have it every 2 weeks. I mean, it's just, it's really remarkable. You control all your inputs, so you're not creating any pollution. The birds aren't pooping on your crops. It's incredible. The long story short is that it doesn't work on any real scale. I friend of mine started one of the indoor farming companies called Bright Farms. He ended up getting fired because he was always complaining that the ambition wasn't big enough. What he was always saying is like, we're going to solve the lettuce problem. Maybe someday we'll solve the strawberry problem, but we're not going to solve the food problem. And of course, his board was like,
because the food problem is a grain, mainly a grain problem, and grains don't really, like what they're growing in these vertical farms is mostly leafy greens. And
exactly, the high-end stuff. You can grow weed in a vertical farm and make a lot of money. Strawberries are the highest margin thing in your grocery store. You can do it with that. But it just, the energy costs too much. And it's just like the sun is awesome. So the purely vertical farms.
Is it just that then? It's just that
no, it's a little
the energy costs too much.
That's the sort of short-term problem. But
because one of my questions is like a lot of the technologies I cover here on this pod are only really going to work at scale without subsidies if renewable energy gets lots cheaper. So a lot of solutions are pending that basically. And so I'm wondering, like, if we got to something like energy abundance, trivially cheap renewable energy, would that solve this problem, or are there other things?
It would make it a lot better. I mean, I think, but right now it uses so much energy. I think I remember I was doing back of the envelope math with this one guy who had invested in one of these greenhouse type deals. And we calculated that it would take, I think, 30% of all current renewable energy in the United States to grow like America's current tomato crop. And tomatoes are not like a big part of, again, like, we have a couple 100,000 acres for lettuce in the United States, and we have, a couple 100 million acres of crops. So it's just really tiny. The real problem is that you can't grow these, at least nobody yet has figured out how to grow the kind of big five, the corn, soybeans, wheat, rice. This is a big problem. And I will say that I wrote a piece about, this was back when Plenty and Bowery and AeroFarms had billion-dollar valuations. I wrote a column saying that the headline was something like, vertical farming just isn't going to work. It was in Canary. And I took a lot of crap, and now all three of those companies have gone bankrupt. So,
Okay, indoor farming, probably good for some nice boutique high-end crops.
Exactly.
Not a scale solution. Another thing people are obsessed with in this is food waste. You often hear, we don't have a supply problem. We grow enough food to feed the world. The problem is distribution. It's not getting to the people who need it. We're wasting enormous amounts of it, et cetera, et cetera. So how should we think about food waste in the solution set?
So I'd say two things about it. So first, I would say that that it's true. Like, it's absurd that we waste a quarter of our food. Some say a third. I think it's more like a quarter around the world. In the rich world, it's mostly, we just waste it on our plates or at the restaurant. In the poor world, it's more, we waste it close to the fork. They waste it close to the farm because they don't have good ways to store it in a silo. Yeah, they can't get it to market. They don't have the right harvesting equipment, the processing equipment. And so the first thing I always say is like, yes, it's a huge problem, because when you waste a quarter of our food, that means we're wasting a quarter of the land we use to grow the food, and the fertilizer and the water.
A quarter of the Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, I'm for getting rid of food waste. Everybody is. It's hard. And that's going to be a theme of a lot of these solutions, is that, like, I'm sure we'll talk about eating less meat, which is also really hard, but it's especially hard because we love meat. Nobody loves food waste, and yet it's still hard. I just did a piece for Slate about how there's a lot of data that shows, we're all pissed off because food has gotten more expensive, right?
Yeah.
I think we just like picked a new president because of it, right? Oh, it's terrible. We're paying too much for groceries.
And subsequently, eggs have risen in price almost every day since.
Right, and now the new guy's unpopular, and that's probably why, not because of fascism or any of that stuff.
Yes.
Everybody hates, paying more for food. Well, we are not wasting less food. So, so it is just, it's hard. That said, there are a lot of things that I'm excited about. There are these technologies where you can better manage inventories if you're a grocery store.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wondered, is like, what's its scale? Because whenever I hear about solutions to food waste, it's always these kind of local, incredibly high touch, like we're employing people to drive to restaurants and gather this. And, it just doesn't sound like stuff that could scale to any appreciable.
I mean, I think some of it's, groceries, again, because they have a purely economic motive and they're better at acting on economic motives. These things like flash food, where, you get the app and when food is ready to expire, they put it on sale automatically. AI puts it on sale for 50% and you come to the store. That's really moving the needle. And actually groceries are doing a better job with their waste. And I think, there are these like appeal sciences, which has these kind of biotech invisible peels that you coat avocados and bananas with so they last longer. I think that's exciting. And there are policy levers you can use too. I just mentioned expiration dates. Well, most of them are bullshit, and certainly the best buy dates. But it's sort of whataboutism, right? This idea like we don't need more food, we just need to waste less food. And you also hear, or we all just need to go vegan, or or we just need to reduce population growth. And what it really, to wildly oversimplify the math, is that we kind of need to do all the things. Even if we reduce the current US goal and global goal is to reduce food waste in half. Even if we do that, even if we eat 50% less meat in the rich world.
Quit skipping to the meat thing, Mike. We're not to that yet. We're getting to that later.
Even if we get rid of biofuels, we stop using them entirely, we're still going to need to grow our agricultural yields even faster over the next 30 years than we have over the last 60. So we're going to need a lot more food.
Okay, so food waste, important, but one bit of the buckshot here.
Yeah. Don't waste food.
So my understanding is that fertilizer is a huge problem here. It's got a bunch of nitrogen in it. It's polluting water. It's messing with the greenhouse. What about now? Like, I'm always reading about cool synthesis in electrochemistry and all these abilities we have now to make new materials. Is there any promising attempt to make more benign fertilizers?
Yes, there are some exciting things. The first thing I would say is that half of all, we just talked about food waste. Half of all fertilizer is wasted too.
Just overused, imprecisely?
Overused, and it's annoying because, food waste just ends up in the landfill, and it fills up our landfills, creates a little methane. Fertilizer waste, we call it pollution, right? It's either, it's nitrates that end up in the, creating the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico or the algal blooms in the Great Lakes, or it's nitrous oxide emissions, which...
And that is because of the nitrogen.
Right. And
it's all of that basically come back to the nitrogen.
Yeah, nitrogen fertilizer is literally made out of natural gas. It's so obviously if you could think of ways to use less of it, that would be really awesome. And right now, this is going to be really shocking to you, Dave, but in the United States, we mostly rely on voluntary measures from our farmers. And this is probably going to be even more shocking. They're not working all that well.
Is fertilizer just so cheap that there's not that economic incentive? Because, these are like big corporate operations. You'd think they would be cutting costs. You'd think they would be thinking of ways to use less fertilizer on their own. You wouldn't think they would have to be forced to do so.
You would think that, but here's the, and they are not idiots, these guys. They run businesses, and it's not just because Koch Industries is selling them the fertilizer, which, has something to do with the lack of, fertilizer regulation. But the fact is, and this is maybe skipping ahead also, the gains they can make by better yields, they so outweigh the costs of buying a little excess fertilizer that they call it insurance N, like insurance nitrogen. And basically, even with, and there are exciting technologies with, some of them through precision agriculture, where your tractor basically tells you where on your field needs fertilizer and just drops it there, as well as some of these, actual alternative fertilizers. Right now, there just isn't that much incentive if there's any danger of losing yield.
Well, let's get back to the alternative fertilizers. Yeah. Is that a big thing? Like, can you fertilize without nitrogen?
It's starting, and so there's a company called Pivot Bio that's backed by Bill Gates that I'm pretty excited about. And look, there's a lot of arguments over how well this stuff works, and we're not entirely sure. But it's on 5 million acres in the United States, 5 million corn acres. So that's a pretty good
alternative fertilizer. What's it?
Yeah.
How did they avoid?
It's cool. So, and this is one general theme, I think, in a lot of agriculture and probably a lot of society, is that the 20th century was chemistry, right? All these chemical solutions that did really cool stuff, but often had these really toxic unintended consequences. The kind of mess that fertilizer makes being a classic example. I tell a story in the book about Norman Borlaug, the founder, father of the Green Revolution. I talked to this guy who has since died, but he was 93 years old when I interviewed him. And he went to Iowa with Norman Borlaug. And sort of the punchline is that Norman Borlaug told him, that fertilizer is the Achilles heel of the Green Revolution and makes such a mess. The 21st century is going to be biology. And so Pivot Bio has essentially genetically engineered microbes. They tried the holy grail was, can we just, re-engineer these crops so that they can kind of fertilize themselves? And that just hasn't worked really well yet. But what they did was they re-engineered these microbes that naturally fix nitrogen from the air and bring it to the soil and feed plants, but have kind of gone dormant because there's already so much fertilizer so much nitrogen in the soils. It basically, it turns off their sense of smell, or so that they keep fetching nitrogen even though it's already there. They're no longer lazy.
So they fetch the nitrogen from the atmosphere rather than us putting it
which is what the whole chemical, the Haber-Bosch process that converts air and, the alchemy of air, turning air into nitrogen. This is doing it biologically. And right now they say they replace about 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is about 1/5 of the fertilizer on a typical U.S. cornfield. The idea is that, it's as it works, and there's pretty good evidence that it's working at least a little bit and that it isn't harming yields.
I mean, is there a horizon you can see where that gets better and better and makes a substantial? I mean, obviously these things are difficult to predict. I have all the faith in the world in electrons, but I don't know enough about biology to know whether to sort of lay all my money on I'll put all my chips on that. But is that a solution to the nitrogen problem, or is that just another one of these sort of trimming it at the margins things?
No, I think that this is the idea is that this can really take a big bite out of it over time, as with, better gene editing, technology is cool.
Well, this segues into my next question, which is about genetic modification. I have some criticisms later of the technocratic approach in this book, but this seems like an area where the technocrats have it right, and the hippies are just wrong about this. There's been a lot of objections to GMOs, and as far as I have heard, no research whatsoever showing physical health harm. This obviously puts aside the politics and power questions, but the crops themselves has not been shown to hurt anything.
Not in the human health. It's these are the most studied stuff on earth. And I agree, the hippies are wrong. That said, this is the technophiles who made a lot of big promises about GMO crops. Most of them have been somewhat disappointing in terms of the spectacular yield increases. They've been overhyped somewhat.
Yeah. What's your level of, what's the sort of appropriate level of hope to put in? Gene fiddling.
I think especially on the crop side, there's pretty good reason for hope on the gene editing. This seems really cool. These, the way they did genetic modifications, it was really kind of haphazard. You're just sort of bombing these crops with, and sort of hoping something weird and cool and Spider-Man-y happens. And it just didn't work that well. But with gene editing, you can be really precise. And you combine it with the artificial intelligence and these supercomputers where, I tell this story. I went to the University of Illinois where they are literally trying to re-engineer photosynthesis.
Yes. And the point of the AI and the computing is just you can run simulations of these things that
Exactly.
would have taken weeks or months. You can do dozens in a day. So like,
Right, and would have taken tens of thousands of dollars, and you can do it for pennies. Like at University of Illinois, they have set up this supercomputer that models the 170 steps of photosynthesis. Because it turns out photosynthesis, it's 3 billion years old, right? And it does like a good job of maintaining life on Earth and everything.
pretty good record established.
Yeah, so like but it turns out to be pretty inefficient.
Yeah.
It's always, it takes carbon from the air, but it often grabs oxygen by mistake. And it turns out that it doesn't react that well, like when the sun, like a cloud blocks the sun for a bit, photosynthesis turns off, and then it's really slow to get started again. So these guys have sort of figured out, where's the gene that kind of restarts it? And let's have more of that. Anyway, they're doing stuff. It's going to take a long time, but it's, you could really be looking at like 20, 40, 50% yield increases. And on the fertilizer side, you could be looking at replacing 20, 40, 50% of it.
Yeah.
And fertilizer has about as much emissions as aviation.
Interesting.
So probably a little bit more. So we're talking about like big numbers here.
Yeah. What about another favorite of the hippies? And by the way, I hope listeners know that I refer to hippies out of love and identification. I am, of course, a hippie myself deep down, as you well know me.
I just did a debate at Berkeley where I was sort of debating a hippie professor who was, pushing some of the agroecology regenerative stuff we'll talk about later. But Alice Waters was sitting in the third row just glaring at me the whole time.
Well, okay, so there's a lot of hope being put into trapping carbon in the soil. Soil carbon is a big hyped thing right now. The idea is basically that you can just change your farming practices in such a way as to lock more carbon into the soil where it will stay stably. And as I understand it, will boost yields, will boost the fertility of the soil also. Am I making that up? Tell me what's going on with soil carbon and how big of a deal I should think of it. Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts. People using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Tell me what's going on with soil carbon and how big of a deal I should think of it.
So on the soil carbon stuff, I try to be very measured about a lot of this stuff, and since so much of it is ideological and a lot of it, the truth is, both really is somewhere in the middle. Carbon farming is bullshit. A lot of the regenerative practices that you see in Kiss the Ground and Common Ground that are being pushed by General Mills and Archer Daniels Midland and PepsiCo and RFK and Joe Rogan and Michael Pollan and Al Gore. So
when we're talking about soil carbon, we're just talking about regenerative. Are those basically the same thing?
Well, the thing is, regenerative is more, they would say the regenerative movement would say it's about soil health, and it really does help with soil health. They would also say that there are kind of societal benefits as, when you're creating these regenerative systems as opposed to extractive systems. There's a lot to be said for all of that, but they also say that it stores a lot of carbon in the soil and that basically you can reverse global warming by essentially taking all that carbon that we've pumped into the sky and just farming differently, and it'll come down in the soil. And that is just not true.
Okay, well, we're going to get more into regenerative later. We're going to argue about that at the end. I'm saving that for our finale here.
I should say, though, that trees are great stores of carbon, like planting trees, which is part of this movement, right, through agroforestry.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Hedgerows.
Yeah, reforesting deforested land is like...
Oh, yeah, fantastic.
Who could not love that?
Oh, and we should say, and remember, my first book, which was when I first met Tim Searchinger, was about the Everglades. And Tim gave me the first tip that sent me to the Everglades, where I, wrote the book and met my wife and moved to Florida. But restoring wetlands is that's the best bang for the buck. If you can take wetlands, that's we're looking for one billionaire who could put in a few $1 billion and literally reduce 1 or 2% of global emissions by restoring wetlands.
All right, let's get to one of the things that everybody wants to talk about. If I am, as an individual, concerned primarily about climate change, what is the best change I can make to my diet? What 3 foods should I give up if I'm most concerned about climate change?
Beef and lamb.
Beef and lamb.
It's, ruminant meat is really, it's the baddie. And that's what I've done with my diet. I've cut out beef and lamb. If you can go vegan, that is awesome. That is the best. Beans and lentils are by far better than chicken and pork. But beef and lamb, the ruminant meats, are so much worse than chicken and pork that it turns out that actually vegetarians, also great, but no better than just cutting out beef and lamb, because vegetarians end up eating more dairy, and cows are really the problem because they are eating the earth.
Yeah, I guess you're dodging beef, but if you go to dairy, you're still supporting the cow agriculture.
Right. And dairy isn't as bad because, cows only produce beef once, while they produce, dairy on a shockingly constant basis if you go to one of these industrial dairies.
So this is beef and lamb first, and then there's a big gap.
Yeah, exactly.
Further down the list.
Less beef is really important. I mean, beef, they provide about 3% of our protein or calories, and they use about half of our land. It's just an incredibly inefficient machine of converting animal feed into food. There are lots of cool things about cows, but...
Is there a name for a diet that avoids cows and lamb and dairy, but not chicken and fish? Just an anti-cow?
Can we call that the Grunwald diet? I don't know.
Exactly. Somebody needs to put a diet book out.
It would be a climavore diet, to name check my RIP podcast.
But the reason vegan is best is mainly because of dairy. It's cows.
Plants are the idea. Plants are.
They're healthy too.
Plants are great, and the plants are healthy. Well, look, Doritos aren't healthy, right? Or but in general, eating plants is a lot more efficient than eating plants that have been laundered through an animal, right? And that's what dairy and beef is, right? It's the chickens eat soybeans, the cows eat corn, and they turn it into beef. And I'm sure we're going to get to fake meat too, and people say oh, it's processed food, but I like to remind people that what goes on inside a cow's stomach,
that's a
process. It's crazy. So,
but if my concern is animal welfare, as I understand it, chickens are the number one problem from that point of view.
That is
just
true.
Because there's so many, and so their suffering is so extensive.
And they're treated worse. It's horrible.
The cruelty of the chicken game is truly horrific.
It's funny. I talk a lot in the book about how Yes, a big part of the problem is that we are going to need, particularly in the rich world, we're going to need to eat a lot less beef. But that means that we're also going to need more efficient beef. And it turns out that you can make beef more efficiently. Chickens are already like the 42 days from like, egg to broiler is just, like they grow so fat that they can't stand on their legs.
It's awful.
It's horrible. And you can't do it more efficiently. They've practically reached their biological limits. While cows, there's, for better and for worse, there's still a lot that can be done to.
What you just like with cows, you're tweaking their diet so their like gut biome works differently, or what's a more efficient cow?
I went to Brazil where I saw these ranches. Mostly, they have just millions of acres of degraded land and degraded ranches in Brazil. Where you'll have like one cow on 10 acres, and I saw these incredibly efficient ranches, some of which, by the way, use a lot of regenerative practices, including like no-till and cover crops, and they let the cows wander around the crops, which is something that the Michael Pollan types love. But they also do a lot of industrial stuff. They had feedlots and they fertilize their pastures, and they can put, 7 cows on 1 acre. And so it's like, when you're like 5, 6, 7 times more efficient in producing beef, that means you're using 1/5, 1/6, 1/7 as much of the Amazon.
Okay, so important marker there, beef and lamb.
Yeah.
Absolute climate villains, unquestioned, unambiguous.
Yeah. And grass-fed is even worse, by the way. It's like, from a climate perspective, not only because of the land, but because of, as many of your listeners know, the burps and farts is a real problem. And
Yes.
and if you just, grass-fed beef, which spends their entire lives in pasture, it can take like twice as long to reach slaughter weight as it does for a feedlot fed, which is, they only spend a couple months in the feedlot. But that means they get to slaughter weight a lot quicker, so they don't spend the extra time burping and farting and creating methane emissions.
And this is one area where, and I think there are lots of these in agriculture, where a concern for climate and a concern for, let's say, other environmental and social problems don't necessarily point in the same direction, right? Like grass-fed beef might be better for like the welfare of the cows. It might be better for the biodiversity of the farm. It might be better on other metrics that you care about, but it will be worse strictly on greenhouse gases. Do you agree with that general point that those are different in a lot of cases?
There are definitely trade-offs, but the environmental trade-offs are not always obvious. And I just do point out that like the eating of the earth that I bang my spoon on my high chair about is not just a climate problem. Remember, this is like, we're destroying the habitat, these habitats for, this is what's creating the 6th mass extinction, right? It's not like pesticides in the air. It's agriculture taking over the earth. And
land.
It really is.
Okay, before I talk about engineered meats, which I do want to talk about, let's talk about some of the other possible large-scale protein substitutes that people toss around. Bugs, seaweed, cultivated microorganisms. Are any of these sort of large-scale alternative proteins going anywhere?
Well, they're all off to a slow start, I would say. But look, I think insects could be a solution for. I don't think it's like that's what we're all going to eat when we grow up. But I think it can replace a lot of fish feed. I think it can replace, hopefully someday a lot of animal feed. And remember, we use a lot of land for that. So I think it's promising. I think the idea that these are mostly efficiency questions, and there are some really efficient animals, that are very tiny that grow protein pretty quickly.
This is sort of George Monbiot's. Is that how you say his name? I actually don't know. I don't know that I've ever said his name out loud, but that's his whole thing, right? He wants to just wipe out normal farming and replace it basically with like microorganisms that are
right. Well, I think
much more efficient in producing protein for energy input.
he fell in love with a couple of potential solutions that I think are very exciting potential solutions. But I think, we should absolutely be letting 1,000 flowers bloom. But I would not shut down agriculture until these other solutions. I think that's one of the things that always kind of irritates me. There's this idea, it's like, well, let's first start by having lower yield agriculture because we know there are all these other things we can do that can, help us feed the world without frying the world. And I'm always like, why don't we make sure that other stuff works? And then, maybe we won't need all this agriculture.
I'm going to flip that around on you in a minute, but we're not there yet. So of all these alternative proteins, is there one or a set of them that you think are particularly more promising than others? Like
Sure.
Is seaweed a meaningful? Is that hype or?
No, I mean, I think seaweed as a feed additive for to get the cows to burp and fart less methane. I think that has some promise. I don't think as a food source I haven't seen a lot of excitement, but some of and this is getting towards the fake meat stuff generally, I do think biomass fermentation, which is essentially you put fungi into a beer brewery and it just grows into something that is kind of shockingly like meat and shockingly nutritious. It's like.
So what's your take on fake meat then? This is one of these things where like.
Right.
Very few people have had any direct experience with it, but people love to have takes on it. It's a take attractor.
It is.
What's your take?
I started working on this book. My first reporting trip, I went to the Good Food Institute conference, basically the fake meat conference in 2019. And so this was a few months after Beyond Meat, which does the plant-based meat, those burgers. They had just gone public, and it is still the biggest popping IPO of the 21st century.
Really?
Their stock went up to $250 a share.
It's been a disappointment, though, as I understand it.
Well,
like the plant-based stuff has not taken off like people were hyping it.
Oh, no. Well, at that, in 2019, I thought I was going to accidentally raise a Series A round on the drinks line. It was like the exuberance was, and people were literally having arguments with, are we going to replace meat in 10 years or 15 years? It was like that kind of thing. And so it was over the top. And now, yes, like, Beyond Meat was at $250 a share. Now it's at $2 a share. I went back to the GFI conference in 2023 and it was all doom and gloom. This is dead. We're in the, it's the trough of disillusionment. It's like this was just a fad.
Now, this is the plant-based stuff or the engineered stuff? Because those are very different.
Sort of everything. They're all of the investors who poured billions of dollars into this stuff have, fled for the hills.
Where did they just ban it?
Well, in my state of Florida, and Ron DeSantis banned it. It's banned in Alabama, Mississippi, Montana. That's the lab-grown meat or, the cultivated meat.
Yeah.
But I will say, look, plant-based meat went onto the market and, my take on it is that it was like way better than the kind of veggie burgers of yore, right? Those like hockey pucks that were just for vegans. Yeah. But they weren't as good as meat and they were more expensive. And so it was kind of like a play for...
The sausages are good. The breakfast sausages
pretty good. And I think Just Egg does a really nice job with the, with their egg substitutes.
I haven't tried those.
I think Impossible Burgers are pretty good and Impossible Whopper.
My kid went and had an Impossible Whopper, and he gave it a pretty vigorous thumbs down.
I
was disappointed.
I think those are fine. It's a lot of chicken, like the plant-based chicken nuggets there's really no reason to have a chicken nugget anymore. The plant-based chicken nuggets are just as good. I mean, who the hell knows what's in the real chicken nuggets anyway?
Yeah, I know, because
like
normal chicken nuggets are so distant from meat anyway.
All the stuff these are just vehicles for sauce, and that's fine. But I think right now, the use case for these, alternatives are just for people who are trying to save the climate. And that's, what we learned from Tesla, despite all the other stuff. All of these companies said they were going to be the next Tesla, but Tesla had a really awesome product that people thought was cool. And that has not yet happened with plant-based meat.
And I suspect that they're not going to get there with plant-based meat. I mean, it's obviously like there's nothing wrong with it. I love it. It's great. But like as a scale substitute for meat, I'm very skeptical. Whereas cultivated meat sounds...
Yeah, I mean...
on the one hand, like the product sounds meatier. But on the other hand, the backstory sounds creepier. So what's your take on how it's going to play out?
I mean, I think on all of these things, again, I have a lot of faith in technology, particularly when it's supported by government investment, which is only just starting to happen globally with these alternative proteins. Remember, the first solar panel was what, like 1960, 1960, and it didn't become a thing for like 50 years. The first real even plant-based burger that was designed for meat eaters was basically 2012. And the first lab-grown meat hasn't really hit the market. There's been a couple, in Singapore, you can get, some like 3% cultivated meat.
Have you tried it?
Oh yeah, I've tried it all. And I've tried the chicken,
How is cultivated meat?
It's fantastic because
Is it really indistinguishable from meat?
Well, at 100%, I had Upside's chicken, and it's better than chicken because the chicken we eat today is like bred for grow it in 6 weeks. This was like cells from a heritage chicken, the kind of old fancy chicken, and it was it was delicious. It tasted chickenier than chicken.
Interesting.
I've had lab-grown sushi. I've had lab-grown lox, lab-grown burgers, and I will say the meat. There's some, we've been eating this stuff for 2 million years, and there is something in our, that when you have the actual meat that sends that, it's like 2 million years of evolution saying hello. It really is, even when it's blended with plants, which I think, as this stuff hits the market, and the first US, like Mission Barns, they make cultivated fat, pork fat, that they're going to mix into a meatball. And that's going to be the first product probably that comes to market.
Oh, interesting.
Hopefully this year. And I think, and that tastes good. It tastes, even just fat, even just with maybe 10% cultivated cells, it's a really good product. And I do think, I'm sure you saw, like the New York Times did a big story about the revolution that died on the way to dinner, saying that this lab-grown stuff is never going to work.
Yeah, we've already been through a hype cycle, maybe even 2 hype cycles on this stuff when it's barely even exists yet.
Exactly. I'm really optimistic, and I'm working on a story about this, but behind the scenes, there's amazing progress happening. In fact, the big scientific paper that came out that threw cold water on this stuff, the biggest problem with cultivated meat is essentially the feed. They call it the media. It's like the glop that the cells grow in. It's what they eat. And, to oversimplify, this guy said that these companies will never get it below $6.50, and then in the best case scenario, maybe they'll get it to $3 a liter. Well, they're already below $1 a liter. And I've talked to some firms that are below 50 cents. And so technology, it moves fast. Things happen. And the people who say you can't do it, I say even on the plant-based side, I don't know. I think our species is very bad at changing our behavior. We're very bad at being nice to each other, but we're pretty good at inventing stuff, right?
Yes, a lot there. So we should talk about the main thing here, the main story, which is the reason people in this area are mad at you, which is that
I've noticed
this question of what to do about factory farming, basically about industrial scale farming. So there's a lot of sentiment out there that industrial farming is bad in a bunch of ways for climate, also for particulate pollution, also crucially, socially, morally, politically bad in a million ways.
Very bad.
There's a lot of push towards what's called regenerative farming, which is just kinder to the soils, kinder to the more you switch crops, you leave a field fallow for a year so it regenerates. There's lots of different techniques that have come up. There's been a lot of hype about this, this is one of those things that journalists love to write.
Oh, yeah.
Stories about meet Bob. Bob squinted out over his field,
right.
And Bob's beautiful farm where he knows all the animals and everything.
Right.
So your basic point, and it's not you didn't invent it. The point that you make that other people make too is whatever other benefits regenerative agriculture may have, it produces less yield per acre.
Right.
And if you produce less yield per acre and you're producing the same amount of food, you are using more acres. So in other words, your critique here is by reducing yield, you are accelerating agricultural sprawl. You are requiring more land to produce the same amount of food. So even if regenerative farm is better than factory farm, regenerative farm is not better than the wilderness that the regenerative farm replaced, right? Wilderness is always best. So insofar as you're driving more land use, you are shooting yourself in the foot. You're doing worse for the climate.
You are eating the earth, some might say.
You're eating the earth. And the idea that you are pushing, a lot of other people, is if you increase the yield, the per acre yield through these factory farming, sort of intensive, highly technological means, you then spare that land. You need less land, you spare land, you spare wilderness, and so you come out ahead, basically. Is that a fair summary of the sort of argument there?
Well, you don't automatically spare the land, but you have no chance of sparing it if you've already torn it down. That's for sure. And it's like, the classic example is I read a Washington Post piece about Kernza, which is the regenerative grain that they've started growing in Kansas. And it's awesome. It's perennial. So it's really like nature. It's much more like nature than other approaches. And the headline was something like, a recipe for feeding the world and saving the climate. And you get to literally the 38th paragraph, and they say that they've now increased Kernza's yields so that it's almost 30% of wheat's yields. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, if you're going to need more than 3 times as much land to grow the same amount of wheat, then you are not feeding the world or saving the climate.
Right. Back to the land use, back to the opportunity cost of land use.
I agree with all of these problems with factory farms about how they're like bad to animals, bad to people.
They concentrate power, political power.
Too many antibiotics. They lobby against the climate. They're probably a pandemic risk, although not necessarily more of a pandemic risk than other forms of raising animals. They're bad, bad, bad. But the thing that factories do well is manufacture a lot of stuff relatively cheap. And relatively efficiently. And that is really, agriculture's main job over the next 30 years. What I say is that, and some will say that this is unrealistic too, but, all of this is going to be hard. But, there are $600 billion worth of agricultural subsidies around the world. $300 billion are literally just money handed to farmers. I think we need to have a little bit more of a bargain where it's like, okay, if we're going to keep paying you, you've got to at least be a little less nasty.
Have you ever tried to wrestle $1 of subsidy out of the hands of a farmer, Mike? Have you ever
Exactly.
tried?
I'm saying you can't. So let's at least try to attack. Like, okay, we're going to give you your money, but here are a couple things that we can do that will actually, hopefully work out best. For instance, we talked about wasting less fertilizer, right? Like maybe we can come up with ways and we'll do the research for you. The idea is I think it has to be like you can't. I want your listeners to understand like the extent to which people want to think that they can just transform agriculture. Like the Rockefeller Foundation and remember, and these are the guys who initially bankrolled Norman Borlaug to do the work that led to the Green Revolution. They've put out a white paper where it's a group of philanthropies, because basically any philanthropy these days, if you say the word regenerative, money starts pouring out of their pocket.
What if you said AI, regenerative AI?
That's VCs. That's VCs. But these guys, they want a $4 trillion transition to agroecological systems. And it's not just like, these are the biggest philanthropies, the United Nations, the World Bank, and then these big agribusinesses, because they're like, oh, shoot, we'll push $1 any way you want it, and we'll get our, that's fine. So you have General Mills and Archer Daniels Midland and Danone. These guys are big on this, fine. That's great. We'll have our farmers grow it regeneratively. The problem is we're going to need a lot more farms.
Well, if you're telling them to do something that will require them to triple their production, Obviously, they're not going to complain about,
Right, right.
we're going
Exactly.
to subsidize you and also thereby force you to triple the amount of land that you have in
Right.
production.
I understand why people get upset at me about this stuff because, industrial agriculture does suck.
Well, let me throw this at you. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like at the very least, if the premise of focusing on intensifying yields through factory farming, if the whole premise of that is that it spares land, then at the very least, it seems like before you give these dollars to the farmers, you should require them to spare some land. The idea that like it theoretically spares land. I mean, this is the thing about corn.
Absolutely.
If you look at the history of corn biofuels, like when corn yields improved, they didn't reduce the amount of land they devoted to corn. They just found new uses for corn. That's what ethanol is. So like, this is Givon's paradox, or however the hell you're supposed to say that. This is like, if you make it more efficient, we're just going to use more of it. So like,
Exactly.
you have to build the land sparing in legally, not just like as a slogan.
And this is the failure of RED and RED Plus and all these other like international efforts to protect forests, is that you've got to have produce and protect together. They've got to be conditioned in each other, and we will help you produce more. But exactly like you said, if you help a farmer increase his yields, the first thing he's going to do is like, great, I'm going to cut down more forest and grow more food and like, and get rich. It has to be tied together, and not just for that one farmer, but on a sort of jurisdictional basis. For Brazil, right? You've got to tell Brazil, like, we will give you all this money to work on increasing your yields and protecting your forest, but you've got to have the results. And what I will say is that the first Lula administration was really starting to do this. They were promised, we'll give you a lot of money and we'll help you you work on your yields, but also you work on protecting forests. And they did a lot of this, and the international community did not keep its promises and did not provide the money. And that's part of what led to Bolsonaro. Like, people were pissed. So I do think it's going to take a shit ton of money. You can't do this stuff on the cheap, and it is going to require that there's going to have to be carrots as well as sticks.
Let me come at you with a critique from a different direction then,
Yeah.
which is the argument here is like, we're not going to be able to persuade people to eat less meat. We're not going to be able to persuade these giant, you know what I mean? There's like these immovable barriers.
The argument is that we have to do all the things.
The only thing we can't move is yields. But like, that's a socially constructed fact. The idea that we can't move the meat lever, that this is the only lever that's movable, is socially constructed. And if we what if we diverted all this R&D money away from factory farming into regenerative practices, which has not gotten nearly the amount of, R&D? Are you certain we couldn't improve the yields of regenerative practices if we really doubled down on it and tried?
And as I said, I've seen areas where regenerative practice, I'm not against regenerative practices. I do think the carbon farming part of it is bullshit. But I'm all for regenerative practices, and especially on the grazing side. When I talk about intensive grazing, usually that involves regenerative practices. The regenerative practices seem to increase the stocking rates, and you can make more beef than just, a lot of these like conventional ranches, they call it the Columbus method. You just you send the cattle out in the fall and you go discover them in the spring. And that's really inefficient. Now, these regenerative practices require a lot more labor. They're hard, but I completely agree. I got to push back a little bit on this idea that I'm giving up on meat, I'm giving up on food waste. I'm saying we got to do all the things, and the government has to be involved on the research side, on the deployment side, just like it was with energy. Food is probably about 25 years behind energy, but we don't really have 25 years to, jerk around like we did with, on this energy stuff.
Here's yet another angle, a political economy angle, and this will sound familiar from the energy world, which is if you allow agriculture to become an oligarchic business like this, if you allow power to concentrate in a few giant corporations, And then your solution to the problems that are thereby created is to restrict the corporations through law and regulation. I think the political economy critique here is like, you can't create these powerful, selfish entities and then expect to rein them in. Like that horse is out of the barn. You need to break up the concentrated power here if you want to have any hope of positive reform. Do you buy that at all?
I mean, this is a long discussion, and I would say it's sort of partly true. But remember, like oil companies, they exist to make a product that's inherently bad, and there's really kind of only one way to do it. It's not like there's not a lot they can do. They're just going to fight.
Regenerative drilling.
Now, farming, farming, you can measure emissions, and often like the big guys have, they can afford efficiency in many ways, and they can afford to do things in often climate friendlier ways than, the guys who are just running a few cows or, have a few acres. So I do think it's not insane to think that, and we've seen some examples, the best example is Denmark. Partly because they've done so much on the energy side, they were suddenly realizing like, hey, we're on track for by 2030, agriculture is going to be half our emissions and it's only 1% of our economy. And believe me, in Denmark, they use more land for ag than any other nation except for Bangladesh. So they are like, the ag guys are really powerful there, but they realized they were going to have to come to the table. And they came up with a deal where they're putting tons of money into promoting the kind of plant-based alternatives, but they're also putting tons of money into the kind of things that's going to help these farmers increase their yields and reduce their footprint. And then they are also requiring them to essentially turn about 1/6, 1 million acres of farmland back to wetlands, which is going to have, it's unbelievable. They're going to have a carbon tax on emissions from animals. I mean, this is like, they're doing all the things.
Yeah, they got serious about it.
Yeah, it's Denmark. I know they're the model nation, right? All that. But it's like you never say never. And I do think, like I always say that the book is kind of about how we're going to feed the world without frying the world, which makes it sound like it's kind of two different challenges. But honestly, like we know how to feed the world. And if they have to, they're just going to cut down more trees and make more food. So I think there's like getting them to do it without frying the world is really, the incentives, believe it or not, are kind of focused in the right way. Like there's, JBS is all about efficiency, Tyson Foods, Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, these guys, they have actually pretty slim margins and they're happy to work towards approaches that can make more food with less land. And I would add, for those big guys in particular, the alternative proteins, that's an option for them to make bigger margins. And even as a lot of these venture-funded startups are having incredible trouble, JBS is still going ahead with a cultivated meat factory in Spain. Cargill has invested in Upside Foods and Wild Type, which is doing cultivated seafood. Tyson has invested in Believer, which has built a factory in North Carolina to do cultivated chicken. They see this as, whether it's the short-term future or the long-term future, they see it as the future because ultimately they see that animal agriculture and agriculture in general, like it can't take over the entire world, right? And like we all saw The Martian, that's going to be a tough place to grow crops.
All right, so we're out of time, but as a sort of a way to wrap this up, I mean, the example of Denmark is poignant as always.
My senses were not quite there politically.
Yeah, we're not. Just a little bit shy.
I haven't been paying as close attention to politics while I was working on this book, but my sense is that it has not progressed in a really climate-friendly direction.
Well, this gets to my question. Like, in the U.S., we seem not only so far from where Denmark is in taking this seriously and putting serious restrictions on these companies. They seem more sort of brutally powerful here. I'll never forget when they disciplined Oprah. Remember that? Like to me, that was so telling. I was like, my God, there's a force in American life more powerful than Oprah that can bring Oprah to heel. That is power. They seem more powerful here. They seem like they're getting more powerful, not less powerful. They seem like they're getting more corrupt. The administration is more corrupt and in bed with them. Everything's going in the wrong direction here. So for the individual, you can make dietary changes. You can give up beef and lamb. That's what you ought to do. You could go further and give up dairy, as you ought to do. But that's, I'm somewhat skeptical about the prospect of individual behavioral changes amounting to scaled solutions here as in other areas. So if I'm engaged in this and I care about the problems of agriculture and the climate challenge of agriculture, and I want to go beyond personal behavioral change, what do I do? Like on energy, I can tell people a lot of ways to get involved, that's more than individual action, but short of like federal lobbying. You know what I mean? There's a lot of stuff in the middle I can think of. What is the way to politically organize around this problem? Do you know what I mean? Like, how should people engage in a more than individual action?
Well, let me at least make the case, since I know your listeners are the energy wonks that I, considered myself. I was your people, right? Before I took this 6-year detour, and so I guess the first thing I would say is that you should give a shit about this stuff, because it really matters. And here's the thing, like the next 4 years are going to suck in the United States for all kinds of climate action, right? But actually there's a real difference. Like with energy, thanks to the Dave Robertses of the world, and actually there's probably only one. So maybe just thanks to you, we know what to do. We got to electrify the economy and run it on clean electricity. And, we're sort of even, Trump aside, we're sort of starting to do it, like not fast enough, but it's happening. And this has been this is a story that I used to tell. I started telling it back in my Obama book. And I've,
it's happening, just not fast enough.
Exactly. Now with food, we don't even know what to do.
Right. It's not happening because we don't even know what it is.
And a lot of the things we think we know are just not so, right? So it's not like, unlike with energy, Trump isn't going to be repealing all this progress that's been made, right?
Right.
This is actually a good time for us to start figuring shit out.
Can't repeal progress if you don't make any.
Exactly.
The guy tapping his head mean.
Exactly. And this is precisely. And this is going to be a good time for us to like start to figure out what are these, what are the real solutions? What are the fake solutions? This is stuff that philanthropy, which, if it wasn't just going headlong into just giving money to every hippie who says they're doing, they're going to save the soil. And I should say that they're like Bezos is funding some good stuff on alternative meats, on reducing emissions from cattle. We really ought to be figuring stuff out. And we ought to be thinking at the international level about less crappy global policies that essentially work towards this produce and protect approach.
And the one thing we can all take out of this with crystal clarity is that ethanol sucks and should be crushed into the dirt now and for all time.
Can I say one more thing about that? Because actually, ethanol is a perfect example. Because remember, a lot of the enviros and a lot of the energy people were all excited about ethanol and all of these biofuels, because what they were doing is they were trying to solve their energy problems. And they were like, oh, we'll reduce fossil fuels. And the land sector was somebody else's problem. And now I've spent 6 years, now the land sector is my problem. And I've realized it has come to my attention that you energy people, of which I guess I used to be one of them. But when you're talking about burning wood for electricity, or, we're going to run our planes on corn and soy, you are dumping your energy problems on the land sector. And you shouldn't do that. Like, this is something like energy needs to solve its own problems. And then you energy people should start caring about our land problems too.
There is such a thing as energy abundance, possible and even on the horizon. But there is no such thing as land abundance. Land is
right, exactly.
Intrinsically a scarcity issue. And if you're using it for one thing, you're not using it for something else.
There really is no planet B.
Yes, we're going to get through all the cliches before we're done here. All right, Mike, thank you for taking 6 years of your life to wade into this and figure out just how depressing and intractable it is. All kinds of solutions on the horizon. and 4 years with
none of
nothing
which
better
you
to
give
do.
a shit about.
No, I support them in theory, Mike. It's like, you know what I mean? There's all kinds of good things that I support that I don't care about. Like oceans. Like you think the ag people are mad at me. The oceans people really hate me because oceans are definitely super important. And I don't care about them either, really.
Well, I hope your readers at least understand. And it's fun. The book is fun. It's not dreary like David makes it sound.
All right. It is a rollicking read. All right. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for your work and good luck.
Thanks so much, Dave. And thanks for everything you've done.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.